Kristen, and you're listening to Podcast and Amplify, a podcast for women entrepreneurs who want to amplify their voice and brand through podcasting and grow a wildly successful business. I'm the executive producer and host of 2 shows and an entrepreneur, and I love helping women grow their visibility, mindset, and business to the next level. Each week, I share tips on how to launch and leverage your podcast, and I'm bringing on the very best business leaders to give you advice on how to build your business empire. Let's amplify your voice and business. Welcome back to Podcast and Amplify. So I listen to a lot of podcasts, which might not be surprising to you at all. I love podcasts. One of the things I love the most about podcasting is the freedom to be creative. You can really create a show any way you want. There aren't a lot of parameters because no one's going to come in and say, no, you can't do that. That's not how a podcast is recorded. That's not how it's produced. There's no policing around podcasts and formats. Really, whatever format you can come up with, you can imagine is the format that's right for you. So I love this freedom and flexibility to be creative. And I really do think it's a medium that honors your voice, who you are, and how you want to share your message. So that's why it's always fun for me to listen to other podcasts and hear show formats that are different, slightly unique. And I wanted to share a few of those with you today to hopefully inspire you to think about how you can create a show that really represents who you are. Okay, so I'm going to talk about 5 unique show formats that will hopefully inspire you. So number 1 is to create your show around asking one question. So I heard this show format by listening to the show One Question, Unapologetic Questions for Unapologetic Results. And the host is Kim Argentsinger. And I really loved this format of just asking one question to every single guest. I thought that was really bold to create a show around one question. The question's got to be good, though. So that's one unique show format that I heard that I thought, wow, that could really inspire people to come up with their own question. Maybe it's not just one question. Maybe it's a set of 3 questions that you ask every single guest. And I think the beauty in this format is that it forces you to come up with a question that is just really powerful. And obviously you can ask other questions within that time that you spend with your guest. I thought that was clever. I listened to a few episodes and I really did feel like the conversations were powerful because she was asking this one really strong question. Okay, number 2, record your podcast live in front of an audience. So this isn't really format dependent, but it's a big difference between recording your podcast at home or in your studio to recording it live in front of an audience. And I heard this format recently on Brené Brown's show, Unlocking Us. And I also follow the Podbroads podcast, and I know she's doing a live podcasting event. But what I found when I listened to Brené Brown's podcast is that there was a really big difference in the energy around the podcast, the feel, because so much of the energy comes from an audience. And that really does change the dynamic of the interview. It changes the dynamic of how the podcast feels. So thinking about whatever your show format is, incorporating some kind of live aspect. So it could be if you release an episode every week, that maybe one of those episodes a month is a live episode. But the feedback that was given on that podcast of their experience was that it was a lot of fun. There was a lot of great energy. And if that's something that you want to bring into your podcast, it's definitely something that's not done a lot in podcasting. I think a lot of us think of these really polished studio recorded episodes, but it doesn't necessarily have to be that way. When it's live, you can hear background noise and audience noises, and they were actually at a festival, so you could hear music playing in the background on another stage. So it just definitely created a different feel, and it changed it up from the normal podcast sounding episode. Okay, number 3, record coaching sessions as episodes. I first heard this when I listened to Melissa Griffin's Limitless Life podcast. She would record sessions with her clients, with their knowledge, of course, and then post those as podcast episodes. And they were really great because you could learn through listening to her coach someone who had maybe a similar problem that you had, or sometimes for me, the problem wasn't even something that I was experiencing, yet I still learned something from it. I still had takeaways that I didn't expect. And then I got a peek into what coaching was like. And, it gave me tips for how can I incorporate some of that into my coaching when I work with clients. So it was a really great format, I thought. And just being a fly on the wall during someone's coaching session is really valuable. And she did mention that those were actually became her most popular podcast episodes, more popular than her interview episodes. And she had some really great guests on, definitely well-known leaders. So it was interesting that the coaching sessions seemed to resonate more with people, probably because they felt like they were themselves were getting coached a little bit. Because at the end of the day, a lot of our problems that we need help with, a lot of our struggles are universal. So it's like a little bit of sideways coaching. Hey Explorers, we'll get back to the show in just a moment, but I wanted to take just a few seconds to invite you to the free workshop that I created. It's called The 3 Secrets to Starting Your Successful Podcast. Now it's all about helping you to start your dream podcast so that you can share your voice and expand your business. If you want to join, just go to exploreryou.com. It's totally free. All right, friend, back to the show. Okay, number 4, combine 2 formats into one show. So the idea here is to combine solo format with interview format. So you start out with maybe 10 minutes of your podcast is you speaking on a specific topic, could be you talking about something that's specific to what you do, and then going into an interview where you interview a guest around that topic. And the interview could actually be something totally different, but it gives your audience a little taste of you and your personality and your knowledge and your experience. And then it also provides an interview. And so it's just a great way to pack a lot of punch into every episode because people are essentially getting 2 different episodes in one. I don't really know anyone who is doing this combination of solo and interview in one podcast, but I like the idea of being able to combine them and experiment. I, for example, do both. I do solo episodes every Tuesday, and then I do an interview episode every Thursday. And I could totally see combining them. Could see starting with a podcast tip and then going into the interview. But for now, this format works for me and I like keeping them separate. But I can see this working for a certain type of niche. I just like the idea of experimenting and trying different things, mixing and matching, just to see what's the right fit for you and what's the right fit for your audience. So that's number 4. Number 5, invite a client on to share their problem and then bring on an expert to help them solve it. So I heard this format on the Magic Lessons podcast that came out, I think it was back in 2015. It's been a little bit, but the podcast was created for the book, and the author of that book is Elizabeth Gilbert. It's a fantastic book about creativity, and I recommend it to anyone who is a creative, who is interested in understanding the creative process and your own creative process. It's just a really great book. But what they did was they created a podcast series around that book. And the format of that show was to bring on a writer who had a writing problem. So whether it was a writer's block or maybe confidence around their writing or needing tips on publishing, they'd come on and they'd talk to Elizabeth about what they were struggling with. For the first, I want to say 20 minutes of the podcast, And then Elizabeth Gilbert would bring on an author. So she had like Neil Gaiman, Glennon Doyle, Martha Beck. So she had these really successful authors come on. She talked to them about the writer's problem and they sort of workshopped through it. Obviously, she talked to these really successful authors about their work and their creative process. And then she would have the writer back on and she would give them advice and share some of the feedback that the author had given during their conversation. And I just thought it was a really cool way to give a lot of value to listeners. So I really loved the uniqueness of this podcast format. I haven't heard it done anywhere else. So it got me thinking that maybe this could be a really great format for, say, a business coach to have someone on who's struggling with growing their business and then invite a leader on. Say that person's struggling with copywriting or lead generation, they can invite an expert on in those areas and then talk about how to solve that problem, how to help this business owner, and maybe get a little more specific into that person's struggle with their business. Sometimes I think when we can hear more detailed versions of people's stories, the more nuance we can hear, then that is just a little bit more valuable than it being a super vague problem, which is kind of ironic because you would think the more specific it is, the less relatable it would be. But I don't find that to always be true. Sometimes when someone really digs a little bit deeper is when I have those aha moments of like, oh, yes, they're pinpointing closer to the problem and I actually can relate to that more. Not always, but I have found that to be true. So that's it. Those are the 5 formats that I wanted to share with you that I have found in my podcast listening. Like I said at the beginning of the show, I do listen to a lot of podcasts and I'm always looking to be inspired. And these were some formats that definitely did. So as you're thinking about starting your show, perhaps some of these formats will resonate with you, will make you feel that excitement, and listen to that. That's where you should be leaning into and creating from that space, the thing that sparks something in you that says, oh, that would be really cool. That's where you want to be. That's where the magic will happen for you. So my final tips for this episode are: don't be afraid to experiment. This is the perfect medium for experimentation because it really is a very open, free, and creative medium. Definitely be creative and, like I said, listen to your instincts and make a podcast that feels right for you. Not that is going to sound quote unquote right to the rest of the world, but make something that feels really good for you so that you'll show up every time to record with joy and excitement around what you're doing. And there's no such thing as doing it wrong. There really isn't. This is a medium where there aren't really a lot of rules. So that's number 1. Number 2, expressing yourself and delivering your message in a way that is authentic to you can't be wrong. So just remember that as you go into the process of starting your podcast. Finally, if you go down a path and it feels good at first, but have a couple episodes out and you're just not feeling it, you can always change it. Nothing is set in stone, and you can go from doing solo shows to interview shows, or you can change your podcast music or your intro or your outro. It's really not a big deal. And that's the other great thing about podcasting is it can evolve as you evolve. So those are my tips for today. I hope you found this episode helpful, and I hope it got you excited to really start thinking about creating your podcast. And as always, if you're looking for help getting your podcast started, I'm here to help you do that. I have a couple different programs that I offer to meet your marketing and budget needs. So please reach out and let me know if I can help you in any way starting your podcast. Okay, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week. If you loved today's episode, please subscribe so you don't miss a show. And rating and reviewing this podcast is the best way to help support us. Always remember, your voice and what you have to offer is needed in the world. Until next week, take care.